This legal saga has lasted nearly 5 years now.
Accused of murdering.
I'm nervous. This is a big video. I want to get it right. I need to get it right. But that's why we're starting here.
Took just minutes for a judge to more than double the jail sentence for Oscar Pistorius.
Open sky, over the siren sound.
Okay, let's go. Let's go. Let's go.
This is a dream, getting the royal scar.
No, this is needed, but so is this. I'll tell you why. Let's go. Let's go.
Today was the first day of the very
Your breath still.
This morning it took just minutes for a judge to more than double the jail sentence for Oscar Pistorius.
So, we are no longer in the northwest of England. We are currently in Pretoria, South Africa. And that's because we have recreated Oscar Pistorius' flat meter by meter. And this evening, we are going to walk through exactly what happened in the early hours of the morning on the 13th of February 2013. 14. Oscar then woke up in the early hours of the morning due to the heat in the room. It was an incredibly hot South African night. He turned over and he saw that Reeva was actually still awake. She rolled over to him and she said, "Can't you sleep?" Because of the heat in the room and because he wanted to get back to sleep, Oscar then got out of bed without his prosthetic legs on. He moved over to the balcony where the windows were still open. He closed the windows, he closed the doors, he closed the shutters, and he drew the curtains. He also brought in a fan from the balcony and placed it inside. It was at this moment that the facts of the case all started to change.
I think initially I just froze. I didn't really know what to do. I'd heard this noise. I interpreted it as being somebody was climbing into the bathroom.
When Oscar closed his curtains, he heard a noise in his bathroom, down that way. The bathroom was connected to the bedroom, and Oscar thought that he had heard a window slamming. He thought there was a burglar in his house and he was sent into a state of panic.
The first thing that ran through my mind was that I needed to arm myself, that I needed to protect Reeva and I, that I needed to get my gun.
Oscar then walked around his bed and he picked up a firearm. This is... I don't have a gun, so I'm gonna pretend this is the firearm. The firearm extended in front of him. He whispered to Reeva in the bed, "Get down and call the police."
I whispered for Reeva to get down and phone the police.
Now it's important here to remember how the bathroom was set out, because the bathroom had separate rooms inside of it. So as you turn into the bathroom space, there was a toilet cubicle here, and there was a shower cubicle here. As he turned into the bathroom, he noticed that the toilet door was locked.
I couldn't see into the bathroom at this point, but I could hear the door slam. And for me to confirm that there was a person or people inside the...
He paused for a number of seconds, and then he heard a noise from inside the toilet. He thought that noise was someone trying to get out who would attack him. So at that moment, he shot 4 shots through the toilet door.
The Olympian said that he believed he was defending his home from a burglar, from an intruder, when he fired his gun 4 times through a locked toilet door.
When Oscar shot those 4 shots, he didn't shoot an intruder. He shot Reeva, who was locked inside the bathroom. Now, all of those facts I've just told you was only Oscar's side of the story. That was Oscar's testimony that he presented in court. Now, over the next few weeks at the Oscar Pistorius trial, many of those facts were shown as fabricated. And actually, a lot of the story that he told that happened in the early hours of the 14th of February 2013 were made up. Through witness evidence, through ballistics evidence, and through forensic evidence, many of his facts were shown as completely false and untrue. So that brings us to what this video is all about. In this video, we're going to do a deep dive into the Oscar Pistorius trial, and we're going to find out exactly what happened in the early hours of the 14th of February 2013. This is going to be a big video, and I'm excited to go through it all. Let's go. It's a new day. Hello everyone. You join me on a new day. After plotting out Oscar Pistorius' flat, after hammering those poles into the ground, after walking through the crime and listening to the facts of his testimony, I have one thing to say. This makes no sense, love.
Because it's just not normal.
What was that? This makes no sense, love. The amount of inconsistencies in Oscar Pistorius' testimony, the amount of things he stated which are just so highly improbable, I have many questions. I have so many questions, and in this video we are going to pick apart that testimony. We are going to talk about the most interesting ways that the prosecution was able to prove that Oscar Pistorius was guilty of murder. He wasn't guilty of manslaughter, he wasn't guilty of culpable homicide. He murdered Reeva Steenkamp in the early hours of the 14th of February 2013, and gosh oh blimey, when you start to break apart the evidence, he really didn't have much hope here, and that's what we're going to break apart today. Now I thought what might be interesting, what might be helpful before we crack into the real details of this case, let's look at the key players in this case, because there are some really important and controversial people involved in the Oscar Pistorius trial. So I've created a presentation. That's right, I've created a presentation which I am projecting onto my fridge because I don't have a home studio, but really, is there any difference? I don't think there is. So let's go through the key people. Okay, so let's start off with arguably one of the most important people in this case, Oscar Pistorius himself, the accused. So here we have Oscar Pistorius, and I've assembled some key facts here, but I am now very aware of the fact that I don't know whether you can read that because the quality of this projector is actually very low. So I'm just gonna tell you them now. Oscar Pistorius was an extremely incredible and well-awarded athlete. He was a Paralympic athlete. He won over 20 gold medals. He was the first Paralympic athlete to compete in the Olympics themselves. Another key fact about Oscar Pistorius is that he was a huge gun enthusiast, and that is going to be a fact that will come in handy later on when we talk about the evidence, because his enthusiasm for guns was something used by the prosecution heavily against him. The second key person in this case is Reeva Steenkamp, the victim. Now, at the time of her murder, Oscar and Reeva had been dating for 3 months, and Reeva was well known in South Africa herself. She was a model, she'd been in reality TV shows, but I think most interestingly and most importantly about Reeva is she was a law graduate. She'd been to law school and she had aspirations of qualifying as a lawyer, so she was an extremely bright and intelligent young woman. Now, here's where things get interesting. The next person in this case is Barry Roux. This here is Barry Roux, this man right here. What's up, Bazza? How you doing? Barry Roux was the lead defense attorney, so he was Oscar's lawyer. He was very well known in the South African criminal justice system as being one of the lead defense attorneys, if not the lead defense attorney in South Africa. He was extremely expensive, meaning that he got hired by the most high-profile celebrities and corporations, and he was at the top of his game. However, this was not going to be an easy fight for him in court because he was up against the very fearsome prosecutor, Gary Nell. There's Gary, our man Gary. Gary Nell was known in the courtroom as the Bulldog. He was extremely fierce with the way that he cross-examined witnesses.
You killed her, you shot and killed her. Where did you take responsibility for that?
He had a stellar track record in representing the state in criminal justice crimes, or especially in murder crimes, and he was regularly assigned to the most high-profile and the most difficult and complex cases. He is someone that we are going to follow very carefully in this video. I personally think that the way that he delivered the arguments in this case is absolutely fascinating. There are so many elements of Oscar's story of events that didn't make sense, and Gary Nell found all of them, and he tore them to pieces. Finally, at the center of this whole situation was Judge Masipa. Here is Judge Masipa. Now, Judge Masipa was an extremely impressive woman. She was the second black woman to ever be appointed as a judge within South Africa. She was highly commended and praised by women's rights advocates. However, during this case, a lot of the decisions that she came to when it came to the judgment and the sentencing were extremely controversial. And it's important to note that in South Africa, there isn't a jury system. So in the UK or in lots of jurisdictions, if you have a trial, you have an independent jury that will listen to the whole case and all the case facts, and then they will go away and between themselves they will decide whether they think the accused is guilty or not guilty. But they don't have that system in South Africa. That was abolished under the apartheid. So actually it falls to the judge itself to decide whether the accused is guilty or not guilty. Now in this case, because it was so huge and so complex, the judge is able to appoint assessors. So Judge Masipa had people around her that were able to discuss the facts of the case with her, but the decision itself fell down to her. This trial was extremely long. The crime occurred in the early hours of the morning of the 14th of February 2013. This is when Oscar committed the murder. On the 3rd of March 2014, the trial was underway, and Pistorius pleads not guilty. On the 14th of May 2014, the Pistorius is sent for his 30-day psychiatric assessment. From the 11th to the 12th of September 2014, Oscar Pistorius is found not guilty of premeditated murder, but he is found guilty of culpable homicide. It's worth saying that when I say culpable homicide, that is the South African legal term for essentially manslaughter in the UK. Then on the 21st of October 2014, Oscar is sentenced to 5 years for culpable homicide. Then we jump just over a whole year forward, because on the 3rd of November 2015, South Africa's Supreme Court of Appeal hears the case again. So the judgment that's been made by Judge Masipa and the sentencing that had been made for 5 years was appealed, and it goes back to trial. On the 3rd of December 2015, Oscar's conviction is upgraded from culpable homicide to premeditated murder. Then in November 2017, Judge Masipa's original sentencing is overruled. So there are key individuals in this case, and that was the key timeline of events that we are going to follow as we pick through this trial and its arguments. This light is literally killing my eyes. I think I'm burning through my eyeballs. Like, Jesus, like, how did teachers do it? So they are our key individuals in this case, and that is the key timeline of events that we are going to follow, and we are going to pick apart and work out what actually did happen in the early hours of that morning on the 14th of February 2013. My cornea are burning, my eyesight's deteriorate. So let's start with the fact that jumped out to me first. How did he not know that it was Reeva in the bathroom and it wasn't an intruder? So in his testimony, he said that when he woke up in the early hours of the morning, Reeva was still awake and Reeva had talked to him. So he is not under the presumption that Reeva is completely asleep in bed and that, you know, she had no idea of what's going on. He knows that Reeva's awake. So he moves to the balcony, he closes the shutters, and that's when he thinks he hears an intruder. And he states multiple times in his testimony that he was calling out to Reeva to stay down, to call the police. When he had his firearm out in front of him, he was shouting at the intruder multiple times before entering the bathroom passage. Are we therefore to presume that in any of that period of time, Reeva wasn't going to reply to him? Are we to presume that Reeva would have just stayed quiet?
If Reeva was in bed, she would have heard that as well.
That's correct, my lady.
At least, would you then have expected a conversation?
Like, surely the clear thing in that situation is Reeva would have said, Oscar, it is me in the bathroom. Don't shoot through the door, I'm not the intruder. So that's a huge part of the case that I really don't understand. It's the idea that Reeva was completely silent on the situation and that she didn't call out to Oscar at all. And actually in court, he said, Reeva didn't shout out to me, Reeva didn't call out to me. I had no idea that it was Reeva in the bathroom. And I personally just find that completely implausible. One of the key prosecution witnesses, so called by the prosecution by the state against Pistorius, was Michelle Berger.
Just before the gunshots, it was blood curdling. It was something that leaves you cold.
And Michelle Berger was one of Oscar Pistorius' neighbors. She claimed to hear screams followed by gunshots. So that gives us the presumption that Reeva was calling out to Pistorius before the gun was even fired. Michelle Berger, the neighbor, said it was very traumatic. You could hear it was blood-curdling screams. You can't translate it into words. The anxiousness in her voice and fear, it leaves you cold. Now this is obviously an extremely strong piece of evidence for the prosecution because it shows that Oscar should have known that it was Reeva before he even fired the gun. And also, if we completely forget about Oscar's testimony and about his story of events whatsoever, it could even prove that a whole different series of events happened that night. Perhaps they were arguing in the house, they were screaming at each other, and that's when the gun went off. It's an extremely strong piece of evidence, and the defense came back to this piece of evidence in two ways. Firstly, Barry Roux tried to discredit Michelle Berger's piece of evidence, and this is because Michelle's house was 177 meters away from Oscar Pistorius' flat. The obvious argument for the defense is Michelle Berger's house is too far away from Oscar's flat. There is no possible way that Michelle Berger would have been able to hear what was going on 177 meters away. But they did bring in expert sound engineers, and those expert sound engineers seemed to corroborate with the defense, and they said it would be extremely unlikely to be able to hear the screams of someone from 177 meters away. The second thing the defense did in this situation is the defense brought in neighbors who were closer to Pistorius' house. So for example, Pistorius' next door neighbor told the court that on the night of the shooting, he heard a man crying very loudly. Another next door neighbor, also testifying, said that she heard a loud sound of a male person's voice crying, "Help, help, help." Another neighbor further said that she insisted she heard a man crying, not a woman crying, describing it as a cry of pain. So those three witnesses were saying the only cries out they heard were from a male's voice. I'm quite interested to know how much you can actually hear from 177 meters away. Like, is that totally implausible? If someone was screaming for their life, could you hear them? Obviously, I'm not going to try and contradict the literal evidence from a sound expert engineer. I'm actually very curious as to what you can hear from 177 meters away. Like, would you be able to hear someone screaming from their life? I feel like we have to try and find out. Let's do it. Let's do it. Hi guys, I've just had to leave the house. I'm genuinely intrigued about this evidence. There are a number of factors which we are not taking into account. Firstly, it was in a residential estate, so obviously the way that sound echoes off buildings, very different to like a large field. You would actually expect sound would probably travel faster in an open space rather than with houses that block. Secondly, it's very windy outside today because we love a British summer, and so I am thinking my voice might be carried off into the hills. But we're basically gonna see what we can hear from 177 meters. Let's measure. If I do 177 of these steps, then that's 177 meters, give or take. Okay, you know what? It's not gonna be that accurate, but I feel like we'll get a feel for the distance still. Okay, the 177 meter journey begins. Still have my coffee, have my mate over there, have my mystery sister over there, and we will walk 177. Let's go. Okay, this is 100. My sister is over there. 77 more steps to go. 1, 2, 3, 77, 78. Oh, wait, I went one too far. Wait. 77. We've traveled approximately 177 meters. My sister, I feel like you can't really see her in the distance. She is that tiny dot in the distance. There is quite a fair way. Oh my god, what's that in my hair? We will now see whether I can hear her. I'm gonna ask her to shout something. I hope no one else is around to hear her pretending to be killed. I can hear her. Do it once more! I can hear her. I can hear her. Okay, you might not be able to hear her, but I can hear her shouting Eve. And she's not being killed. I feel like the completely non-scientific conclusion of this, me and my coffee in a field, is that I can hear her. Screams from the early morning of the murder were described as blood-curdling screams. And if I can hear my sister shouting my name in a not particularly energetic way, I think you would be able to hear someone 177 meters away in a completely quiet neighborhood. Is that it's really windy right now, and I can still hear her. Scientific testing, I think you would be able to hear a woman screaming 177 meters away. Sorry, South African experts. Eve and her field experiments have proven you wrong. Oh, at this point it's questionable. We're way beyond at this point. So, the second piece of the prosecution's argument, which I find so fascinating, and I actually think it's one of the things that really helps prove that Oscar Pistorius was telling a lie in his testimony and that he was guilty of premeditated murder. And that is the prosecution's use of ballistic evidence. Now, ballistic evidence basically means everything you can learn about from the use of a firearm or a weapon. So in this case, it was the use of the gun that Pistorius used in the bathroom. And the interesting thing is that both the prosecution and the defense tried to use the ballistics evidence in completely different ways to support their different arguments. Now, the reason why the ballistics evidence was so important was it was key in determining whether there was a delay between the shots that Oscar took at Reeva. Prosecution want to try and prove that there was a delay between the shots. The defense want to try and prove that the shots were all taken one after another, they were immediate. How do we prove that there's a delay? And this is where the ballistics evidence comes into its own. So let's take ourselves back. Let's imagine we are now in Oscar Pistorius' bathroom. So this seat right here is the toilet seat. So they have the closed off room for the toilet and they have a closed off room for the shower. According to Pistorius' version of events, Reeva had locked herself in the bathroom. He thought it was an intruder inside the bathroom. And so he was walking in with his gun in front of him. He was shouting at the door, which apparently Reeva inside the bathroom was not shouting back at him at all. He then pauses outside the door for what he describes as quite a reasonable amount of time. And then as he thinks he hears a sound from the inside, he thinks that's an intruder and therefore he shoots 4 times. Now, the ballistics evidence proves that there was a delay in the shots as he fired them. Shot number 1 hit her in her thigh, and this was because at the first shot, she had her body up against the bathroom door. Now, shot number 2 hit her in her arm. It was just above her forearm. Now, after these 2 shots, the wound evidence then shows that her body then fell to the floor. So there's a period of time between the first, second, third, and fourth shots where Reeva's body falls to the floor. And you can tell that in the way that the gunshots are hitting her body. Now, the prosecution argument is if all 4 shots were fired immediately, so if there wasn't a delay between any of the shots, if they were, as Pistorius said, fired off all at once before he knew it, he had fired all 4 shots, then surely all 4 shots would have hit her in a similar place on her body. She wouldn't have had time to fall to the floor.
She's in a standing position. I would expect both wounds to be here. The first double tap, if it's double tap and then double tap, then all the wounds will be here.
It was as she was falling to the floor, the bullets were hitting her in different places. The ballistics expert actually said that the way that she was falling proves that there was a delay between the shots. So Pistorius' story doesn't really add up that much. For example, I find it completely improbable. I find it almost comical that Oscar is trying to argue that if, as the ballistics evidence proved, there were delays between his shots as he shot out the gun, Reeva wouldn't have responded or screamed back in response, especially if the first 2 shots wouldn't have killed her. The first 2 shots were body shots, so surely she would have screamed out in defense. And why wouldn't that have stopped him from shooting the second 2 shots? I'm just finding it harder to believe this story because that doesn't make sense. So, the third part of this very interesting puzzle, well, there are many parts of the puzzle. There are too many parts. The third part that I think is super interesting is the forensics evidence in the case and the way that the prosecution used this to completely undermine Oscar Pistorius' testimony and question his version of events. As we heard in the testimony, Oscar Pistorius said that, oh yeah, him and Reeva went to bed 7 or 8 p.m, laid our little heads down, and then the murder occurred at 3 a.m. the next morning. There's quite a time gap there, and it also suggests from his testimony that nothing happened in the meantime. There can have been no events that gave him any motive to shoot or kill. He just managed to wake up in the middle of the night. Well, Gary Nell for prosecution came up with some very interesting evidence. He essentially tried to find a way to prove that Oscar Pistorius and Reeva were actually up later that night and things might have happened that Oscar didn't account for. So what Gary Nell did is he brought in expert witness Professor Botha. Professor Botha gave evidence that after 6 hours of eating, you would expect the average person's stomach to be completely cleared of its contents. 6 hours after eating a meal, your stomach has completely digested all of the food. Well, that's interesting because on the post-mortem examination of Reeva, she still had food in her stomach.
If she wasn't abnormal, if that was just a normal person that had something to eat, went to bed, after 8 hours, she would have expected the stomach to be.
And according to Gary Nell, she must have eaten within 2 hours of her death. So suddenly that series of events doesn't really make sense. That claim that they went to bed at 7 or 8 p.m. in the evening doesn't seem to add up. There is way beyond 6 hours between 7 or 8 p.m. and 3 a.m. You would expect any food that they'd eaten to have completely digested, let alone 2 hours before the time of her death. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we know any more about the details of what happened that night in that house, but what we do know is that what Oscar's told us is completely implausible. We are deep within the waters, we are swimming, we are so deep into this case, and I'm very proud of us for making this far and for understanding everything so far. We are creeping our way towards that final judgment, which is very spicy in itself, but let me tell you, there are many more twists and turns before we even get to that final judgment, and to be honest, even when they got to the final judgment, it got appealed, so there's a lot more to go, but I feel well done, we've got this far, and so far we're understanding it. I'm trying to just cope with the adrenaline that this case is giving me and the fact that I can't sleep because I am so emotionally involved in this trial. I seem to think that I am Gary now from the prosecution when I am in fact not, and nothing I say or do can affect the decision because it was done in the past. But here we are. I can no longer drink coffee because my adrenaline levels are too high. So I'm drinking herbal tea, which is kind of good because my organs are slowly shutting down from the amount of caffeine that I'm drinking on a daily basis. So we love health decisions on this channel. Why did I say that like a political candidate? We love health decisions on this channel. So far, we've talked about Oscar Pistorius' testimony. We've talked about his version of events. And then we looked at some of the most fascinating arguments that were brought forward by the prosecution. So we've looked at that witness evidence from the neighbors that allows us to question the idea that Reeva wasn't replying at any point, and the idea that Pistorius had no idea that the intruder was actually Reeva herself. That part of the story doesn't make sense. We've looked at the ballistics evidence that helped the prosecution prove that there were delays between the gunshots, and then helped us question further, how did Pistorius have no idea that it was Reeva behind the locked door? Like, it literally doesn't make sense. And then finally, we looked at that cheeky little forensics evidence that proved that Reeva had consumed food maybe 2 hours before she was killed. So it suggests that Pistorius' testimony about them going to bed at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, it's literally biologically impossible based on the forensic evidence of the contents of her stomach. So we've looked at those 3 key arguments, and I won't lie, Pistorius' testimony is looking kind of shaky. But here's where things get interesting. I think at this point in the trial, Barry Roux, as part of the defense, I think he started realizing that the defense didn't have too much to fall back on. So the defense kind of came in with this last minute wildcard witness. This witness was called Merrill Vorster. Merrill Vorster diagnosed Pistorius with a generalized anxiety condition, and this was based on the fact that Pistorius' mother, who died when he was 14, was a very anxious person herself. When he grew up, his mother always slept with a gun under her pillow, and according to Vorster, Pistorius' father was also irresponsible and mostly absent in his life. So basically, Merrill Vorster looked at Pistorius' past history, the struggles he'd had with his family, the struggles he'd had with his disability, and diagnosed him with generalized anxiety. Now, Dr. Vorster said that by having increased anxiety, Pistorius may have perceived his surroundings to be more threatening or dangerous than they actually were. So the argument here by the defense is that they're introducing a new mental state of mind, and they're suggesting that because of this generalized anxiety condition, Pistorius was viewing the situation differently to how the standard man might view the situation. Then Pistorius couldn't be compared to the reasonable man. The judge couldn't say, well, a reasonable man in Pistorius' situation wouldn't have shot at an intruder because Pistorius had diminished responsibility, and therefore the judge would have had to view the situation from the mind of someone who has that really heightened fear and that heightened anxiety, which would have made the prosecution's case a lot harder to prove. Now, Gary Now from the prosecution was having none of this. This was a hugely last-minute introduction of a witness from the defense. It was a brand new psychiatric diagnosis that he wasn't aware about, and the idea of a psychiatric diagnosis is hugely important in determining whether someone has committed murder or whether they've committed manslaughter. And that's because legally the crimes of murder or manslaughter fall back on what the reasonable person in a situation has done. So Gary Now basically appealed to have Pistorius Pistorius sent away for a 30-day psychiatric assessment.
Former Paralympic superstar Oscar Pistorius has been ordered to spend the coming month in South Africa's oldest psychiatric hospital.
And this psychiatric assessment would truly determine whether Pistorius had any kind of generalized anxiety disorder. Now, court was adjourned for 30 days while Pistorius was sent away to a center where they tested his mental health and really tried to determine whether he had any kind of pre-existing mental health condition which could have affected and explained his actions. Now, when they came back to court, the results showed that Pistorius was in fact not suffering from a mental disorder or defect when he shot Reeva, and he was not incapable of telling right from wrong or acting on the understanding of that right or wrong. So basically, the psychiatric assessment that Dr. Vorster and the defense had brought forward was undermined by this very rigorous and state-driven psychiatric assessment, which proved that he didn't have any kind of mental disorder or defect which would have affected his actions in committing the crime. That's kind of a big blow for the defense, really, isn't it? That's not what they wanted. That's not what they wanted. This is the big moment. This is big. We're gonna have a look at the verdict and the judgment, and this is like a live reaction because I know the eventual outcome because it was all over the news and you might be familiar with what happens, but I never actually read the verdict and I don't know why the judge came to its reasoning. And I feel like because we've now got through this whole process together, we can actually understand how and why she came to her reasoning. So the court's verdict was arrived at unanimously by the judge and her two assessors because there's no jury system in South Africa. It was delivered over 2 days on the 12th of September 2014. On the 11th of September, Judge Masipa dismissed much of the state's circumstantial evidence. I'm guessing that means she's rejected most of the prosecution's key arguments. She said that the state had not proved beyond reasonable doubt that Pistorius was guilty of premeditated murder. Okay. And also ruled out common murder, accepting that he did not subjectively foresee this as a possibility, that he would kill the person behind the door, let alone Reeva, as he thought she was in the bedroom. Wait. Okay, there are many elements here that I already disagree with, but this is very interesting. So firstly, she rejected premeditated murder. What is premeditated murder? Premeditated murder just kind of requires an element of foresight, but like you don't need to have had weeks of planning. You just need to have had kind of like prior intention to kill. And to be honest, arguably it doesn't really matter whether Pistorius thought it was Reeva behind the door or whether he thought it was an intruder. Like the fact that he grabbed a firearm and he shot 4 times, arguably that's premeditated murder. He is shooting to kill. Okay, fine. On the 12th of September, Judge Masipa found Pistorius not guilty of murder, but guilty of culpable homicide, so of manslaughter. That is fascinating. Those conclusions that Masipa came to were very controversial, and at the time it caused great public outcry, especially from the Steenkamp's family, especially from a lot of groups in South Africa that were kind of like women's rights groups and domestic abuse groups. So the state appealed the case and they took the case to the Supreme Court of Appeal in South Africa. South Africa's Supreme Court of Appeal heard the case on the 3rd of November 2015. The prosecution argued that who was behind the toilet door was irrelevant. That's what I just said. It's irrelevant who was behind the door because there was premeditated murder because he shot to kill. The court overturned the verdict of the trial court on the 3rd of December 2015 and upgraded the conviction to murder. They also found that Pistorius was not justified in claiming that he thought his own life was in danger. Damn. And then the resentencing, he was originally given 6 more years. And actually, so she sentenced him for 6 more years for murder. And her sentencing was also appealed. The Court of Appeal added 9 more years onto his sentence. So he was given a total of 15 years. And he will be eligible for parole in 2023. Thank you guys so much for joining me for the trial of Oscar Pistorius. This has been my first ever true crime video and I have enjoyed it so much. I've done so much research for this behind the scenes. I probably spent like 10 to 12 hours kind of like planning, looking into this. I've been so keen to not get any of these facts wrong because we are looking at this through the public eye lens but the reality of the situation is that someone lost their life. Reeva Steenkamp lost her life in this case. I hope you guys really enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more of this kind of content, then let me know, because it's something that I could see working really well for this channel. If you have any cases that you think would be interesting for me to look into, please put them down below. Everyone keeps asking me to do OJ Simpson, but I don't really want to do OJ Simpson because I feel like it has been done so much. Maybe I will. Maybe I will do OJ Simpson, who knows? But basically, please let me know if you have any cases that you want me to look into and to dive into. That's hopefully what we will do more of on this channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you are new here, please subscribe. If you want to find more of me, find me on Instagram and Twitter, and I will see you guys very, very soon. Bye-bye. Deuce. I really took the tone down there. This was quite a serious video.